I got it. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to connect here. It looks like everybody's coming in to the webinar. We appreciate y'all joining us tonight. We are at the end of our monthly webinar series. So this October webinar will be the last Master Beef webinar for the ones that are once a month. And then we will actually start our fall series tomorrow, which will be another set of 10 webinars. So appreciate you joining us on these monthly webinars. And tonight we have a familiar face probably to a lot of you, Courtnie Carter Bridges. Courtnie graduated back in the spring from UT under the direction of Justin Reinhardt and is now working for TransOva. And so tonight she's going to talk with us about reproductive management and a little bit probably about her career as well. So with that, Courtnie, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so like Katie said, I'm going to talk a little bit about reproductive management tonight. But the topic of mine is really going to be how to multiply the success of your herd through using these reproductive technologies that we have available. See if I can. There we go. Okay, so a lot of you might know me because I used to work for UT, but I figured I would take the opportunity to introduce myself, talk a little bit about my background so you know who's up here talking to you tonight. So I started out and got my bachelor's. I actually started at Troy State University in South Alabama. And then I transferred my last year and finished up at MTSU. Just got a basic science degree from MTSU. And then I started working full-time for UT, really in the extension and ag research sector of UT, while getting my master's full-time. And then I graduated, like Katie said, in May of this past spring, with my master's in reproductive physiology, really specializing in beef cattle from UT Animal Science. So yeah, I worked for the UT Extension and Ag Research sector for about 4 years while I was going through that, getting my master's, and then I decided in May to transition into the industry sector of the industry, and I now work for TransOva Genetics. Just a little bit about TransOva, since I'm sure there's some people on here tonight that either haven't heard of us or just don't know much about what the company is. So in 1980, TransOva began business as kind of a premier on-farm embryo transfer service organization. And it was an extension of just a vet clinic out of Iowa. Business continued to grow and grow, and some of the original founders actually to this day still work as an employee for TransOva even through all of this growth. So that's pretty awesome. And then in 2014, we were purchased by Intrexon, and then in 2020 by Precigen. And recently, in this year, we were purchased by Urus. Urus is the company that also owns GenX Semen, for those that don't know that. But we do continue to run and operate as TransOva Genetics. This is essentially just the mother company that owns TransOva, would be a good way to look at that. That's just a little look at the initial small building that we started out as. Okay, so TransOva has multiple locations across the US that serve different purposes. I have a little guide here on the right that kind of distinguishes what those different locations are in each region. But our corporate headquarters are still in Iowa, in a very small town called Sioux Center, Iowa. I had to go through some pretty extensive training this summer when I joined TransOva to kind of learn some more of these more specialized techniques and technologies in the beef cattle reproductive world and also dairy cattle. So I got to spend quite a little time in this small town of Sioux Center, Iowa this summer. And I just had to go through all that when I started my employee with TransOva and doing all that cow work and really getting to see a lot of interesting things at this fully functional research farm is what I would describe it as. But we also have regional centers that operate as kind of a corporate type office. My boss and team are actually located up at our regional office in Maryland, but I operate and cover the state of Tennessee. And then I service 2 nearby satellite centers, which you can see labeled here, one in South Kentucky, one in North Georgia. And then there's also a strong potential for an additional satellite coming soon near the Middle Tennessee region area. But basically these satellite centers serve as a location where producers can haul in their cattle on our scheduled service dates. And this could be for various services that we offer, whether it be IVF, conventional flushing, embryo transfer, etc. Lastly, I wanted to outline our mission as a company, and that is to accelerate genetic gain by applying these reproductive technologies that we have to meet the world's needs for enhancing animal protein production. Some of these technologies are outlined in this image here, but we're going to go through those a little bit later, so I'm not going to take time to list all of them out right now. So how do we improve our genetics in our herd? What does that look like? There are multiple components that go into determining the rate of genetic improvements in a herd or breeding program. When we look at this genetic equation, we can see those outlined. And that would be accuracy, the amount of true genetic variation, heritability of that trait, trait intensity, and on the bottom, generational interval, or basically the time between parents and their progeny. The variables I have outlined in red on this slide are those that can be affected or influenced by the breeder. Accuracy and intensity is going to be with the use of those selection indices that we think about, and then just decreasing that generational interval. Katie, if you want to throw up that poll question, or I guess it's me since I'm the host. So I just launched the first poll question. I kind of just want to get a feel for those in the audience. So the question is, do you currently utilize any of the following reproductive technologies in your herd? Artificial insemination, embryo transfer, conventional flush, IVF, any synchronization protocols that can be either for AI or natural service. I probably should have added a none of the above, but I didn't, so just don't answer if it's none of the above. But I'll give maybe a minute or so to answer that one. Okay, I'm going to end poll. It's okay if you didn't get to answer it. Share results just so kind of y'all can see. Can you see that, Katie?
Yep.
Okay. So we have quite a few that have used some of these, which is awesome. So I just kind of wanted to see what the audience was like tonight, and what all you guys are utilizing currently in your operations. Okay. So when we think about our toolbox, if you will, as producers, and more specifically in this case, our reproductive toolbox, there are really a number of things that can be in that box. In my toolbox, or what works for my herd, might not be the same as what works for Jim's herd. There are just so many factors that go into beef cattle reproduction and proper management. There's no way I could possibly put a list up here and say, okay, here is A, B, and C. This is what you need to do to reach optimum profitability and productivity in your herd. So I say that just to say I've listed some of these technologies up here, and a good deal of these are what I would call more specialized reproductive technologies. I also could have added artificial insemination, synchronization for natural service, interval pregnancy checking, and so on, so on. But I really wanted to take the time today to discuss these technologies. One, because it's a huge portion of what my job entails, right? And two, because I think it's very important to understand these technologies and what they bring to our industry as a whole. And then three, because you may hear something tonight that sparks your interest and could greatly benefit your operation. A lot of these are not just for purebred producers. A good example of this would be, we've talked a lot about utilizing what's up here called in vivo flushing, also called conventional flushing, in commercial production to really increase the amount of calves you can get out of your best calves, to try and target the way that you're making yourself replacement heifers and being able to maybe make some better replacement heifers to retain in your herd that way. So the different tools I have listed up here: embryo transfer, again, in vivo flushing, in vitro fertilization, sorted semen, just sex sorted semen, reset solutions, genotyping, cloning, and gene editing. So the first tool I'm going to talk about and walk you through the process of is in vivo flushing, or also can be known as conventional flushing. How this works is a donor female is identified for whatever reason that may be. Usually it's her production traits. And she's stimulated using a synchronization protocol to ovulate more than one egg, right? So why do we do this? Because we don't want to go through the process of flushing her to only get one embryo, right? So we stimulate her to grow multiple follicles to ovulation size, so that then when she comes into heat and she's bred, usually by AI, we can have multiple embryos to be able to flush out. Makes it definitely more worthwhile, the cost and our time. So those embryos then grow and mature in the cow for 7 days until they are flushed out. After they're flushed out, they can be transferred fresh directly into recip cows that we have set up, or they can be frozen in liquid nitrogen, just like we do with bull semen for AI, and then used at a later date. So I just mentioned how we stimulate these donor females to produce more than one egg. And this is a good example of the drug that allows us to do so. So it's called FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. And its purpose is exactly how the name sounds, to stimulate follicular growth, right? So cows actually make this hormone naturally as well to grow their own follicles, but there are certain dynamics involved in these hormone pathways that are in place to not allow her to have numerous calves at the same time. You guys have probably seen a diagram very similar if you've been through Master Beef before, and I promise I'm not going to get crazy sciencey, but I just think that this is very important to understand, and helps you understand the whole process and why we do what we do with these technologies. So you have these follicular waves that begin to grow together, and eventually you have what we call selection, and a follicle grows into dominant status, while the smaller, not selected follicles die off or become atretic. You'll see the A in this diagram outlining atresia, or the follicles dying off. And a big part of this, these smaller follicles becoming atretic and dying off, is this dominant follicle, represented by the D, is producing a hormone called inhibin that kills off these other follicles, or basically starves them and allows them not to grow to ovulation status. This diagram is showing a cow with a 3-wave cycle. Some cows also have 2 waves, so it looks just a little bit different, but it's the same hormones and dynamics that we're going to talk about. But So you see what you see happening here with this first dominant follicle wave is it's now becoming atretic and dying off, since this other hormone called progesterone, labeled up here up top as P4, is in the blood supply. So it dies off, and about that time, you have another wave emerging with selection and then a dominant status follicle. And then what eventually happens that allows ovulation of a dominant follicle is getting rid of the progesterone source, right? Which happens by this event labeled up here called luteolysis, or killing of the CL, the corpus luteum that's producing this progesterone, or removing the progesterone source that's causing this, whether that be a cedar or whatever you're using for synchronization. So how does FSH play a role? How is this hormone playing a role? How are we growing these follicles? The synchronization protocols involved in IVF and this in vivo flushing that we're talking about right now requires timed injections of this hormone FSH so that we can continue to grow these waves. And essentially what it does is feed these follicles that would be dying off by providing exogenous FSH so that they are allowed to grow and that they aren't getting starved by this dominant follicle. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better understanding of why we use FSH and these synchronization drugs associated with this. But now let's go through the flushing process. So a Foley catheter, what's called a Foley catheter, you can kind of see it right here in this image, is threaded through the cow cervix, just like an AI rod. But unlike an AI rod, it's going to be taken further down the horn. And this picture is actually depicting it a little bit more shallow than I would place mine, but it serves its purpose to tell you about the process as a whole. So these catheters have 2 inlets that will be exited, and you can kind of see the image of the guy down here that will be showing in the external genitalia outside of the vulva. So you have 1 inlet to a balloon, and that's going to hold the air. So normally this looks straight like a little rod, but we have this circle in here where we have blown up the balloon with air, which shown here. Yep. And this is really to help hold this catheter into place and then blow up the balloon. Yep. So it holds the catheter into place and helps it not to slip back while we're trying to flush this uterine horn. Okay, and then we have a second inlet down below the inlet to the balloon. That is where fluid can be pushed through to flush these embryos out. And these are my little embryos here. You can see them in the farthest tip of the horn. At this stage of maturity and production, these embryos are still very close to the tip of the horn and where the oviduct would open up to the uterus, if you're familiar with your anatomy. So this inlet serves as the purpose to flush the fluid in and then flush the embryos back out into your syringe. And we usually do 6 syringes per horn. So what we do is we flush this horn, and then I will actually reposition my catheter to flush the other horn. And then the procedure just repeats itself. So 6 syringes per horn. And then, excuse me, chute side here, we have a filter that filters out the embryos, catches the embryos, and allows the fluid to flow out to the bottom because we don't need the fluid. I think I showed that here. Yeah. Okay. So we pushed our embryos in. They're in this filter, letting the fluid out. And then after that flush is complete, the filter is given to the embryologist that's there, and they would look under the microscope to find these embryos that we just collected. And this is a good image depiction of the different stages and different qualities that you might see of the embryos that you flush out. A question I always get asked is, how many embryos can I expect in a flush? And the average number of embryos recovered company-wide right now is between 6 to 8 embryos a flush. And this is going to be very donor specific. Some cows perform a lot better than others in vivo flushing and thus produce more, and then some not as well and produce less. So again, this quality and the embryo grades and the amount of embryos you're going to get per flush is very donor specific. Before I transition into IVF, are there any questions about flushing? You can also ask them at the end. I just thought I'd ask real quick. Okay, if you think of one, just hold on to it and you can ask me at the end. I'm going to try to not spend a lot of time presentation wise tonight so that I can take more questions at the end. So now we're going to transition into another one of our tools, which is called in vitro fertilization or IVF. So this technology you might have heard called different names as well. I usually refer to the process as OPU or oocyte pickup, mainly because I'm the tech and that's a portion of this technology that I'm involved of and in control of, right? But basically how this works is an ultrasound probe is taken in vaginally. And at the same time, the tech is palpating rectally for the cow's ovary. The ovary is brought over to the probe so that it can be seen on the ultrasound screen. And then a little needle is used to poke into the ovary and aspirate the follicles out. The needle is connected to a tubing system and a vacuum pump, so it's able to suck the fluid out of those, out of the follicular contents, basically. And this is a very minimally invasive procedure. As you can see on this image, the cow depicted has a calf in utero. So this is safely done while a cow is pregnant. There is a pregnancy window that we generally recommend, but again, this is donor specific as well, really just because some carry so low so early on that it just depends on and is a matter of not being able to reach the ovaries anymore because they've dropped over that pelvic rim and there's a lot of weight associated with the uterus pulling them down. So that is the OPU portion of IVF. And then this is a little bit more of the overall IVF timeline or what happens after that OPU. So what I just showed you in the image is this, this first little circle under donor, and that's the OPU or oocyte pickup, retrieval of the eggs. And what happens is after I retrieve those, I give them through a window to the embryologist. She searches, gets all the oocytes out. Since I'm in a satellite center, those oocytes are shipped to a lab elsewhere. Some of mine go to Maryland, some of them go to our lab in Texas. And they are matured for 20 to 24 hours in a maturation media. And then the eggs are fertilized because they haven't been fertilized yet, right? Because I'm taking them straight from the ovary. And this can be done with sex sorted semen if the client wants. But after fertilization, these are cultured for 6 days. And then a lot of other stuff goes on in these 6 days. At the end of those 6 days, they are going to look at these embryos again under the microscope, grade them, put them in straws and freeze them if that's what the client wants, ship them out to be transferred fresh if that's what the client wants. So these can also be frozen in liquid nitrogen or transferred fresh into the cow. And you can kind of see the growth, and this is just a cartoon depiction of what we call a blastocyst or a 7-day embryo. And then this is just an external view of what this setup looks like. So you can kind of see palpating. Oh, that's an older ultrasound in this picture, but looking at the ultrasound screen to see the ovaries, and then this probe is in the vagina, and it's actually a pretty small probe. I know it doesn't look like it, but it is. Here's another up close picture of that probe. Yeah, and then let me pause this real quick so I can talk about it first. This is going to be a video of what the ultrasound screen looks like when I am aspirating follicles. So on an ultrasound, fluid shows up black. So these black that you're going to see is going to be the follicular contents that we are aspirating. And then you can kind of see the circular structure, and that's going to be the ovary. So I'm going to play this real quick so you can see what I see when I'm aspirating follicles. It's pretty cool. Of course, now it won't play. One second. It wouldn't be a Zoom presentation if you didn't have technical difficulties. If you have a question or think of a question while I'm dealing with this, feel free to type it in the chat box. That's what I get for pausing it. Okay, one second, guys. Let me reshare my screen. Okay, we're back. Now let's see if it'll play. Okay. So you can see the needle coming in and sucking out the contents of these follicles. You just kind of rotate the ovary around so you can get all of them. You'll notice a lot of these follicles look larger. This is going to be what we call a stimulated donor, or a donor that did receive that FSH injections that we were talking about that helps them grow a more uniform population of these larger follicles. Just going around making sure you get all of them. Okay. So it's a pretty cool process, especially if you've never seen it before. But then transitioning into what do they see in the lab? So this is a microscopic view of those oocytes that were just collected in that OPU that we just watched. And all this little bubbly looking material around is what's called cumulative cells. So these actually get stripped off during that culturing process that we talked about. So why IVF? Get asked this quite a bit too. What's the difference? And honestly, it's going to be donor specific, like we've said with everything else, or cow specific. So there's some donors that just don't produce very well with conventional flushing. and IVF might be a better suit for them. They might produce more embryos and be much more productive in that kind of environment compared to what it takes to produce embryos in an in vivo flush. They might have an abnormal reproductive tract, so making flushes hard. Might be a terminal female. Might be pregnant. You can't do a conventional flush when they're pregnant, right? You can't flush the uterus, but you can IVF while the animal's pregnant. Juvenile heifers that might not be ready for a flushing environment. I have done some 7-month jerseys, so you can start them pretty young. Increased collection frequency. This is something I haven't talked about yet. With in vivo flushing, you're looking about 1 flush per every, let's say 40 days is usually what we recommend. But IVF, most of my donors are on a 1 week on, 1 week off timeline. So if I collect them, I'm collecting some this week, they'll have next week off, and then they'll be collected the next week. And then, yeah, it's just the best utilization of this sex sorted semen, and the only place for reverse sorting semen. So sorting semen that's already been frozen. As well as IVF can be done unstimulated. So you don't have the cost associated with the synchronization drugs. FSH is a pricier synchronization drug because of what it is. But with IVF, you can do donors that are not stimulated. And this data is a little bit old, but it pretty much depicts what we're seeing now, just with an even less difference between IVF and conventional flushing, because I always get asked, what's the difference between this conventional flushing and IVF as far as pregnancy rates? And the way I like to look at it is a frozen conventional embryo from a flush is comparable to a fresh IVF embryo, right? So you're going to have a little bit lower pregnancy rates associated with an IVF embryo compared to a conventional embryo. But again, this gap is closing, as you can kind of see, and the amount of embryos collected per flush is closing, as much as pregnancy rates, as we continue to adapt and grow this technology and be able to expand and utilize it more. So the last tool I will discuss is cloning. And this is definitely going to be the most specialized and not widely used technology that we've talked about, really mainly due to cost and also just unfamiliarity, right? But I thought it would be neat to discuss the process and kind of what all goes into it. We do some cloning at TransOva Genetics. I got to spend a little bit of time with a Red Angus gene clone while I was in Iowa, and also a couple dairy calves that had the slick hair gene edit. So a lot of neat stuff happening in this sector of the industry for sure. Okay, but a little bit about the process. So we identify the animal to be cloned, which is up here up top. We're going to isolate and culture a cell source, whatever it is that we want to clone from this animal. And then we have these donor cows that we are just using for their oocytes, what we just talked about with OPU. So we are going to isolate or take out those oocytes from these cows, and we're going to take the DNA out of those oocytes because we don't want this cow's DNA. We're trying to clone this top cow. So we just need this shell of the oocyte. And then we are going to transfer those source cells into this shell that we have from this oocyte donor, allow them to fuse together, culture, and then that is going to be how we produce these identical clone animals, by fusing in this DNA from the animal that we want to clone into the oocyte shell of this donor animal. And then just some pictures of some clones. And I know that was fast, Katie, but like I said, I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. I know people are gearing up for fall breeding season. So even if you have questions unrelated to stuff I talked about tonight, synchronization, AI, whatever it may be, I can also answer those. If you want to follow TransOva, here's some of our outlets for that. And I will take any questions you might have.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Courtney. I am always intrigued by the cloning thing. And I had just a random question about how common is that, I guess, now compared to when it was a newer technology? And do you see that becoming a tool that people are going to use more or less in the future?
It's definitely getting used more and more for sure. And it'll probably continue on that track. It is kind of a niche market currently, and really in a niche area with people that are utilizing it. But I do see it becoming more utilized in the future for sure, especially as we continue to expand on the technology and improve on the results overall.
Y'all feel free to use either the question and answer box or the chat. There we go. Greg Upchurch, I knew I could count on you to have a question for us. Greg asks, how long can an embryo be frozen and still remain viable?
Hey, Greg. So how long can an embryo be frozen and still be viable? I don't know if I have an exact answer for you on that, but I have seen some frozen for 30 plus years that have still inseminated a cow. So when they are frozen in that liquid nitrogen, they are frozen at a temperature below the activity of cellular level, right? So indefinitely, I guess is what I would say, with proper tank management.
Can you talk about, Greg just asked another one, but I want to step in real quick. You said tank management. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know that people always say have them, sitting up on something, not on the ground, or those kinds of things. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I'll first preface, when we talk about tanks, we're talking about liquid nitrogen tanks, either for semen preservation, embryo preservation, or both. So there's different ways to make sure that your tank remains useful and has a long lifespan. Some of the recommendations are to get on a service schedule. Is going to be the easiest way to make sure that you keep your liquid nitrogen at the appropriate level, and you're making sure that you stay filled to a point where you have enough nitrogen in your tank to maintain that semen in those embryos. And like I said, the easiest way is going to be to get on a service schedule with whatever semen provider that you use. And then as far as can they be sitting on, where should I store it, blah, blah, blah. Definitely inside, out of the weather. And it is recommended to not sit it directly on concrete because it can eat away at the bottom of that tank. So usually we say just put a piece of cardboard under the tank so that it's not sitting directly on concrete.
All right, we've got a couple more questions that have come in here. One of them is, what are the typical costs associated with IVF versus flushing?
Yeah, I see Greg asked that. That's usually what I get that question quite a bit too. What are going to be the difference in cost between IVF and conventional? IVF is going to be a little bit more expensive, but again, that's going to kind of depend on exactly what you're doing IVF wise. Are you doing stimulated versus unstimulated? Because in those situations, you have the cost of those drugs. You're looking at about $75 more per IVF embryo than conventional embryo. And that's not really taking into consideration what you spend on synchronization. So they can actually get pretty comparable if you're doing non-stem IVF compared to conventional embryo transfer, where you have to use the synchronization drugs.
All right, we've got another question here. It says, more and more seed stock operations are going to or selling IVF embryos. What are the best practices to increase IVF conception versus conventional conception?
Yeah, so A good rule of thumb with increasing your conception overall is going to be recip selection and management, right? So making sure that we are selecting and choosing those recips that are going to have optimum fertility and are going to be able to take those embryos. So that's going to be a big one to bridge that gap. Honestly, I showed some of the data, but like I said, this technology has come such a far way in such a short amount of time that these embryos are actually pretty comparable between conventional and IVF. And it's becoming much more widely used, especially like they mentioned, a lot of these purebred places are going to be selling these IVF embryos. And yeah, so we're pretty much bridging that gap with improving our technology year after year. And again, just making sure that you are doing proper recip selection.
All right, we'll give people a couple more minutes here if they have any questions in the Q&A, or you're welcome to put them in the chat too. Courtnie, if there was one technology that you had to choose for most producers to adopt, which one would it be?
Yeah, so I'm envisioning a lot of commercial producers on this call. And I could be dead wrong with that. But kind of like I said in a previous slide, something that I really think has a lot of potential to help commercial producers is going to be that conventional flush of some of these cows that you've identified as high producing cows overall, or your most productive cows in the herd, and using those for a conventional flush, and then putting those embryos into recip females so that you can better create these females that you're retaining in your herd.
All right, we got another question popped up here. What is the total cost of embryo in the flush and IVF?
Yeah, let me pull up my cost sheets here for you. I know off the top of my head that an IVF embryo is going to be about $175 per embryo. And then with cost of flush, as well as a freezing fee for that conventional flush embryo, you're looking right at $110. So again, a little bit of difference there, but that's not taking into consideration those synchronization drugs. So about $175 per embryo for IVF, say about $100 for a conventional flush embryo.
All right, another question here. Do you recommend a vaccination regime prior to embryo implanting? Pregnancy vaccine, multimin 90, etc.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I always strongly encourage to have a good relationship with whatever vet you're using. And I'm sure they have a good exact regimen for you to follow as far as vaccinations. I don't like to give a lot of vaccination recommendations because I'm not a veterinarian and it's not my specialty. But just making sure that you have those animals vaccinated and in good nutritional standing, and in good mineral standing, right, Katie? So either with using multi-min, or if you've had a free choice mineral out year round, is going to be the way to go. Something you have to be conscious of is not waiting too close to breeding season to start vaccinating, because some of those vaccinations do have tendency and the ability to cause inflammation around the ovary. So you want to make sure that you are vaccinating before breeding season. I like to say about 60 days before your breeding season starts, making sure that you're getting those animals vaccinated, and then that allows them time to get an immune response going and really have the appropriate response to that vaccination before they become pregnant.
Then Greg had a follow-up there. What is the percent success rate? I guess on that question that you asked, that you answered previously.
Yeah, Greg, are you talking about as far as transferring an IVF versus a conventional embryo, or as far as how many embryos you're going to get IVF versus conventional? Okay, I think he's talking about as far as transfer success. So again, that is going to vary with a lot of different dynamics as far as are we transferring fresh IVF embryos? Are we transferring frozen IVF embryos? And then vice versa with in vivo, are they fresh or frozen? But like I said, I like to say that a fresh IVF embryo is going to be very comparable. We can say the same rate as a frozen conventional embryo of the same grade. And again, those are going to depend on, as well as, are they fresh or frozen, or what grade are those embryos that we're transferring. But they are pretty comparable rates. We like to say, but above 50% for sure with our transfers. Getting into the 70% is going to be really what we like to see, but between 50 and above is going to be what we usually see with those fresh and conventional and IVF embryos. But again, that's very farm specific, and it's going to vary location to location and as far as what you're transferring.
All right, any last minute questions here?
I have a little slide here. I just did a beef meeting in Bedford County a couple weeks ago, and even though it's not, let's say, my forte in this company that I'm with right now, I do like to talk about it a little bit because I think it can really help producers, especially producers that aren't necessarily utilizing these technologies yet, but have the ability to really decrease this generational interval that we talked about and an overall calving interval. And that's going to be this synchronization of estrus for just natural service. So this is a study and some data that comes out of Kentucky. Justin Reinhardt used to talk about it a lot before he stopped and started a new position. And then I kind of talked about it a little bit while I was with UT. So you might have seen this before. But when we're talking about sync for natural service, we're really just talking about helping those females cycle sooner and get bred earlier to our natural service bulls. And the way we do this is we implant a progesterone source for 7 days. You can see up here, I have that either as a cedar or MGA. Just be conscious with the MGA, that's the feedable form of progesterone, as it is only labeled for heifers right now, so not cows. So on a Saturday, you'd put that cedar in. Cedar stays in for 7 days. Take it out on a Saturday. So Saturday to Saturday, Friday to Friday, whatever 7 days you choose. Cedar in, then cedar out on Saturday. That day you take it out, turn your bulls in. And this actually, just this little short 7-day exposure to progesterone has shown to push these animals up an average of 30 days. So it's pretty crazy. So you can see these numbers here from their study. I'll focus on these bottom ones, the control versus the cedar animals, and the amount that conceived in the first 30 days. With the control, you're looking at 45%. And with just placing that cedar in for 7 days, they were able to double their conception to 80% bred in the first 30 days. So pretty outstanding results for just a simple solution of a cedar in, cedar out for 7 days. So I just wanted to throw that out there real quick.
We had another question come in. Can someone that does their own AI work implant frozen embryos?
Can someone that does their own AI work implant frozen embryos? I don't think frozen embryos are covered under vet practice laws, but I could be wrong, Greg. So I encourage you to look up Tennessee vet practice laws before you do that. And I also encourage you to maybe get some data under your belt and make sure you can actually transfer embryos, because I know it seems like it's kind of the same process of AI, and it is, but one, the rod is a little bit different. It's a lot longer and it's a little more flimsy, and you have to take that embryo a lot further into the horn, kind of like we talked about with that catheter, because you want it on the same side as the CL. And I see Greg said that's someone who's wanting to do their own. Yeah, you can do anything to your own cows, right? So yeah, you should have no problem with that. But again, it is a little bit different than just breeding the cow AI. So I guess you could try it 1 year and see how your numbers go. But I do encourage you to do a little bit of research on embryo thawing because it's different than bull semen, and then the overall process of it. And you'd also have to have the ability to palpate a CL, a corpus luteum, so you know which side of the uterus to put that embryo on. So there's a little bit more to it. It's a little more technical. I hope that answered your question, Greg.
Good questions coming in. Does anybody else have anything here before we wrap up?
I put my email back on here. Y'all feel free to email me if you have any questions or need anything or want some more information about TransOva, our satellite centers, what all we offer. If there's anything like that that we can do for you, help you with, I'd be happy to.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions pop up. So again, thank you, Courtnie, for talking with us tonight. It was a good way to wrap up our monthly series. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate you all joining us for the whole year on our monthly webinars. And we look forward to seeing you at other meetings. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Y'all have a good night.
Thanks, Katie.
See ya.